Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. Join us as we explore the latest advancements and discuss how these innovations are shaping the future of security. With Jesse, a skilled recruiter, and Ramin, a seasoned security leader, this is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year 2025. This is our first episode for 2025 at Securing the Future podcast. I am your host, Jesse Meadors, and with me, as always, is my trusty co-host, Ramin Lamei.
What's up, guys?
He hasn't changed his intro, so you're not going to expect to see it anytime soon. Well, we're excited to be back. We took a little holiday break, so our listeners who were looking for episodes in December, we did not get anything done. So we are finally back, and we're excited to kick off this year with Derek Samford. Derek and I have known each other for, I think 5 years now. And Derek is a security leader and also product security, application security leader for a lot of highly regulated industries. I'll let him talk a little bit about his background as he gets into the topic. And we're going to talk about the evolution of application security and how the landscape is really going to change into 2025. Of course, we're all hearing the hype about generative AI and how do we start adopting that properly into application security. I think the perspective Derek's going to bring with over 25 years of experience in IT and network engineering, and then security roles all the way up now into a VP role for a large fintech company. It will really be able to help our listeners just as you're looking at how do I adopt the right tools, what's actually being effective, what works, especially in a highly regulated industry where you're going to have to be much more mindful of what you do and what you adopt and how you protect the data of your customers. Derek, welcome to the show, man. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jesse and Ramin. I appreciate y'all, and it's great to be here.
Awesome. Derek, I guess let's dive right into the topic. And I know you wanted to walk through some of your experiences that I think give context to how you see things. But let's talk about, from your perspective, you're leading product and infrastructure security currently at a more regulated environment, but you've worked in a lot of cloud native environments. And I think that's where a lot of our listeners operate in. And so what are you seeing right now? What's your viewpoint on the landscape just currently within how you protect your applications and your digital products?
Yeah, for me, I think the number one rule, and this has always been true of the industry, right? But it's making this easy to happen in an organization has become the most important thing, and that's visibility. Security engineering has always looked to find deeper visibility into the security posture and the attack surface that we're facing. And one of the things that cloud has changed is our ability to do that, both when you look at your infrastructure as service providers, whether that's AWS or Google, the ability to get deep context around your assets and infrastructure via API has really changed the landscape of what it means to consume security tools in many ways, right? When you look at many of these vendors who have changed the nature of vulnerability scanning, there's still value to agent-based scanning, but there's other approaches now. Many people who are simply scanning the storage, right? Snapshotting areas of your infrastructure, and not just in terms of vulnerabilities and attack surface scanning, but also data scanning and data security posture, data classification, managing data at scale inside of the cloud. All of these things, areas of technology you couldn't have even thought about prior to the cloud, right? If you had a data center full of servers and you wanted to know your attack surface, you were installing agents on a data center full of servers at full stop, right? So I think, and Kubernetes is the same sort of thing. You talk about cloud native, the ability, and it's even better. You have deeper context in many ways when you look at Kubernetes, and especially when you look at the way many of the tools that you leverage things like eBPF are evolving to provide like these deep application behavior insights and application posture insights that just, again, not possible in legacy tech stacks.
It's interesting, Derek. You talk about legacy, right? I always think about legacy, like data center models, as you have a perimeter around your environment, right? So you can protect it through like a DMZ, you can restrict what's facing the internet. But as you move towards the cloud and more people in your environment have access, you lose that control, right? You're giving that access out, or a developer can now expose something to the internet. They can move data in a different way where, before those type of controls were more locked down. Now you're more borderless, right? So you're now trying to operate on not just one cloud, right? I'm sure there's tons of SaaS solutions that companies also use, like Workday, Salesforce, other big companies like that, or even small ones where you now have data repositories all over the place, right? And it's a very challenging job for security engineers to figure out, how do I secure all these products as the vendors on the technology side are still evolving, right? There's so many new security technologies that are out today that 2 years ago weren't the same, even the same name or same, it wasn't even the same kind of, what do you call it in security, where you have like acronyms, like this is going to be a IDS, or even that. I feel like some of those are even dropped off because they're all blending together as you move towards like the cloud.
I think you're seeing right now a lot of evolution in those spaces, right? I've been in the industry for, unfortunately for myself, saying it out loud, over a quarter century now, right? And we have watched these like security models just fundamentally change. You mentioned perimeter-based security, right? Trust-based security. The entire industry, or at least I would say anybody who is keeping up with trends and trying to evolve, has since pivoting or pivoted to a zero trust security model, right? It's really only the biggest players who have, you could say, have afforded to pivot, the pivoted past tense. But everybody in the industry is trending in that direction of eliminating trust boundaries as a concept in security, right? There's a lot of zero trust. To me, is funny. It's in many ways, it's a trend in the industry. But for those of us who've been around a long time and have been preaching this a long time, we really just, I think of it's amusing to watch the rebranding of least privilege with a flashier, more consumable, executive friendly term actually take traction, right? Because that's all zero trust is, least privilege writ large.
Well, the principle, right?
Yep. And it's interesting, right? Because all it did is, to me, zero trust just called into question security mantras that had become not questioned by the industry, right? You had a DMZ, and that was just a thing you had. And sure, of course it had no security controls. It's the DMZ, right? And I'm not saying no. Of course, many people had an IDS in front, and it was just a more open place. But now the whole mentality of anything not being as secure as anything else is starting to really become passé.
Yeah. Let me ask you, as a practitioner today, right, in 2025, where do you prioritize for your controls, your investments? Are you more focused now on like the product, the data? Like, where do you guys see that trend going?
I think for me, a lot of what we're going to be seeing is about context, about, yes, having application context to what you're doing. Now, so for some people, currently that has meant building out an ASPM, and that is an evolution. For a long time, it was this wall of tools with really no consolidation. You're just feeding walls of really varying levels of signal and noise to engineering teams about what issues are in their products, and to varying degrees of success, depending on the level of noise you generate, is about the level of friction that you tend to have with other engineering leaders. And so watching that, managing that, tuning that has always been a journey, and delivering the results to the right people. All right. And a lot of this building context, it's at every level, right? What are the findings that I have, and who are the actual owners of those findings, and how do those findings tie together to some existing business concept? One of the things I think security doesn't do often enough is strive to meet the business where it's at. I think some of the newer waves of tools are trying to help do that, right? When you look at, again, the ASPM market, and just kind of ASPM and remediation platforms, whichever you want to call them. I feel, again, we talked earlier about acronyms colliding, and I think that's one of them, is remediation platforms and ASPMs being a different thing, kind of silly. And that has been a converging model. Same with asset management and remediation platforms and ASPM. There's all these things that existed in silos in Gartner, and every one of the vendors is doing something better than others in some ways because of where they came from in those bubbles. That's an area that's converging rapidly. And the same around when you talk about CSPM, right? you're seeing a lot of changes. You have the gorilla in the room, Wiz, who just launched a sensor, which is pretty disruptive to the existing CSPM market. But also it makes, I think, Wiz, for probably their first time, more vulnerable outside of the space that they have made for themselves. They spent a number of years claiming an agentless framework, and now they're driving deep at the people who had built their reputation around agent-based and being embedded in the Kubernetes space. And I don't think anybody has any idea how that'll play out, but you see a lot of evolution, I think, there in general, right? The cloud to code models that you see from, I think you see it in Sneak and you see it in Palo Alto, and a bunch of evolution in that space, both from the largest players and also the smallest, the folks like Oligo and other folks out there. None of these are people I have a relationship necessarily with, but I just watch the moves that they're making, and they are absolutely shaping a change in that space pretty strongly. The cloud security posture area, ASPM area, I think, again, those are areas that probably should never have been diverged. That's another area of collision I actively see happening. DAS just got acquired, and all these other, again, remediation platforms. Again, a lot of convergence, a lot of changes to existing acronyms that have been well defined by Gartner for a few years now that suddenly I think are very murky and with a lot of bleed through in most of those spaces.
So Derek, as we look at the utilization of generative AI, the thing that's like the new cloud, right? How do we adopt it? What's effective? Let's concentrate a little bit on your world of application and product security. Are there some tools that you found to be effective that utilize large language models or any other form of generative AI that you're finding to be helping your team become more efficient?
So this is obviously a pretty nascent space, and there's not a lot of tools I can give a verbal blessing to at this point, as we're so early in how we're looking at these things. What I will say is that, one, there's a lot of things to look at when you're looking at, it's easier to, I think, talk about the enablement of AI more broadly and how you get to a place where you can use these things, right? You mentioned being in a regulated environment. One of the things you have to be very considerate about is what data am I sending to this LLM, and how can I use things that are safe, right? Understanding the data storage model and the general infrastructure security practices of whoever is hosting your LLMs is going to be paramount, right? And that to me is one of the kind of problems or trade-offs that you're having right now. Is a lot of the major LLM companies are very small and relatively immature in terms of time, right? And I'm not in the side of this framework anymore, thankfully. I've been to a lot of frameworks in my career. FedRAMP is one of them, and I would bet money that they're not quite FedRAMP high, right? I know that they have just recently gotten some government contracts, and that there's research going on within the DoD in those spaces, right? But even if you talk about even OpenAI, I don't think it's quite there, despite even the relationship with Microsoft. But you can look at, in terms of enablement, there are vendors who you probably already have become comfortable with managing your data or storage, and as long as they have commitments around training of data that you are comfortable with, like in many organizations, the comfort of training your data is zero. And that tends to be where I live. Like, there's not a lot of incentive for me to have one of these foundational companies have unrequited access to enterprise data at any company I've ever worked at, right? There's mechanisms to enable that, right? When you look at AWS Bedrock or even Microsoft Copilot, right? If you're already a heavy Microsoft shop, you already probably have trusted Microsoft with the data that we're talking about. That is probably a ship that has sailed. In that respect, enabling AI is important. But in AWS Bedrock, it's very localized, and that's more local access to models. It's not in the pipelines that would provide these other companies access to training data. You can look at those, and in terms of enabling the core technology itself. And so that's like just the first start to get there, right? How do you secure these things? How do you think about them as applications in the first place to get to the place where we are automating these use cases, of which there are a lot to wrap up to actually answer your question. The use cases I think that are the most interesting right now, right? You still have to be very careful about the applications of LLMs in terms of what you can trust them to do versus what you can't. I think that the areas that they are the most promising AI threat modeling is going to be huge. And I think enabling people to get rapid, real quick and contextual threat model without the effort that it takes right now is going to be huge. There's vendors out there that I think are leading this conversation. There is, first of all, I think it's called Stride GPT, which is an open source model out there that is specifically focused on this, which I think is really cool. Furious Risk, who are really interesting vendor to me in the threat modeling space. They're driving AI threat modeling from two perspectives. They have a classic chat with the security engineer AI threat modeling capability that they've introduced recently. I haven't played with this. It's just, I pay a lot of attention to the industry. They introduced something that's a security design review via AI. So it watches Jira and enriches tickets where there might be risks, which I think this kind of automated secure design review as things are passed through your work management system, I think that's going to be huge. General AI, I would say AI security enrichment, that's into a number of places, whether that's your Jira tickets acting as like a commenter, code acting as a code security reviewer, right? AWS QDev just released the ability to do code reviews and unit tests driven through QDev. And that's a level of code enrichment and PR enrichment, right? And then finally, probably AI-assisted remediation, right? Especially in terms of things like SaaS remediation, that I think most SaaS type vendors are likely to have answers to that rapidly. And I think that you're also going to see a lot of people driving custom grown things based on whatever RAG kind of system that they're building on their own for their code base, whether that's Copilot or something homegrown or QDev or whatever else that may be, right?
It's interesting, Derek. The way I look at AI in the workplace today is I break it down into two buckets, right? And I generally have these conversations with smaller companies under 500 employees where they're asking a lot of questions where they don't know, right? They need a lot of education to understand what these things are, what are the risks, and then how could they think about an approach. But generally, it falls into two buckets. One bucket is around users, right? How are users allowed to use these tools and capabilities to do their job? So that's one bucket, right? And I think we covered that in the past, so I won't go too far in that one. Then you have, to your point, the more automated functions you can either embed into your products, where it can enrich your functionality and features, or you can help automate and maintain and make some of the operational functions smoother and less expensive, right? And imagine patching today. If you have a person patching, that's very expensive, time consuming, and it's a very mindless kind of work, but it's very necessary. AI would be wonderful, things like that in the future as those models evolve and they become better. It makes sense to use them there. But typically the companies that we interact with, they ask the question of, how do I control the LLM? Who has the data, right? And it immediately turns into a data security conversation. Once you start talking about my data, it stops being an AI conversation because AI is just another capability at the end of the day. Then it's who owns that data? Who's going to be managing that data? Does that data stay on-prem? Does that data leave here? And that's where the risk really comes in for a lot of companies, especially bigger companies, right? In the more regulated space, you don't want that data to leave, right? All these capabilities, whether it's a security company or others are going to be creating, they're now challenged because they have to support these data privacy tech models as well. They now have to offer their technology more client side versus just throw it in the cloud and everyone pumps their data in there. Those are some of the obstacles and challenges. It's fascinating to think about all the use cases you can solve with AI. I come from a payments background and I've worked with payment clients or financial clients as well in the recent past as well. And a lot of them want to use it around like fraud monitoring, where you don't necessarily need to put sensitive data into your model. You can put more trending data, right? Where it's higher level, where you're not putting credit card numbers, but you're putting transaction amounts, transaction dates, some of those type of things. And then you're making calculations and risk type of scoring based on that, right? So I would say it's a really challenging area. And I think in your shoes, you're constantly challenged because not only is the capability changing, new companies are popping up, but then you also have to figure out what's that right balance for your company with the features and the security you can wrap around it.
Yeah, I mentioned AWS Bedrock. Right, we are a relatively AWS native shop. And so one of the things for us is being very comfortable with AWS's shared chart And Bedrock is also not sending its data out, to your point, keeps things local, not to act as an advertisement. There are a lot of other model frameworks that do this or that don't train on your data explicitly. It just depends on how you're consuming them, right? And interestingly, I think that you're seeing a trend where the open source models are showing a trend towards capabilities that are on par with the large models, even at smaller models. The most recent release of Llama 3.3, like the 70 billion variant, being competitive with the 450 billion parameter variant is, I think, an indication of the trend of the industry. Not that the super large foundational models are going anywhere, but at a certain point, many of these are going to reach a good enough for some of the use cases that we're talking about, where you're not talking about advanced code or advanced reasoning capabilities, but rather more sophisticated natural language processing than we've had available to us in the past. Do you think about where you need AI? And this is, I think, another big question that people should be asking themselves. Where should I use AI versus a traditional coding solution? And maybe you develop that with AI, but where like AI is challenging for many aspects. The data privacy aspect is one of them, right? But as a capability, AI is effectively just injecting raw, untrusted input into whatever point of your software pipeline that you're talking about. And you have to consider AI as raw, untrusted user input. That's the only way I've been able to wrap my head around securing it as a model, is treating it like it doesn't exist in terms of any security controls or guidelines that you give it. You have to pretend those prompts that you've told it are going to be subverted. There's just no other option but to assume subversion of an LLM, given its current capabilities. I have yet to meet a prompt I couldn't jailbreak, and I don't know anybody who's relatively advanced in the AI security space who wouldn't say the same. Bishop Fox just released some tools to help auto-generate this stuff. There's a bunch of other tooling out there. I think they're not the only ones, but right now, the capabilities to defend these things are pretty slim. I think this is an interesting space too. I think this is going to be like an industry that dies within itself. It's going to pop up as part of the hype bubble and likely eventually fall off as these, but effectively we're getting LLM firewalls. And eventually I think that providers of these models and the models themselves are going to implement guardrails within them in one way or the other, whether they are their own. Llama Guard is an example of this. LLMs to protect LLMs. But even those, again, you still get to this place where it's not inherently possible to trust that you can't subvert these things through sophisticated prompting to redirect their behaviors.
Very interesting insights, Derek. I haven't heard anybody think of it that way. And actually, I liked the way you were talking about how to approach the data coming in from an LLM. I thought that was a great shift in mindset, and hopefully a lot of security leaders pick up on that from hearing your perspective.
I also really like the LLM firewall concept, right? Because, firewalls have been around for a long time. They're very robust today, right? They're not sexy like they used to be when the next gen firewalls came out, but imagine that concept, right? Where you're regulating or you're controlling at like that kind of level, right? Where you can open yourself up to different LLMs, so you have to go through my firewall. And that's how I can control my data. That's how I can control what you're doing going in and out of my environment or with my data. So I really like that concept. I haven't heard that one before either.
The other way I refer to it jokingly, but not jokingly. Some friends of mine who have been watching this space for a while talk about this a lot. We nanny LLMs, right? One of the ways to protect them is to have, first, from a security perspective, you really want to be looking at the input coming in and protecting it. But you also need to be looking at the input coming out, because that model can be subverted, especially when you're using things like and more modern agentic concepts like functions and tool access. Once you're starting to provide API access to these LLMs, you really have to start thinking about, in the same way that you used to think about, I've got SQL and these systems are using SQL. Now I really should have parameterized queries and not just broad access to SQL. Whatever's on the other side, I actually really, in context, the SQL concept is very similar to how I think about LLMs in some ways. Is that you can subvert, you can get remote code execution out of SQL. You can do a lot of things that are dangerous if your input is untrusted, or if you are blindly trusting the application that's upstream even, right? You don't want to do that either. That's one of the reasons we have parameterized queries, is so people can't do dumb things. And it's the same thing. The level of access you're giving this LLM and the APIs, how you're structuring the functions it's able to call, all of those things, considering how it does them and treating it as untrusted, gives you a way to watch it. So you want to be watching input and output, and many LLMs are an approach that gets you there, but because they're still untrusted input, they can't be the only approach. So just having, again, but treating it like the parameterized queries, some functions that are limited in scope to what you can ever expose to the LLM, is very important, because attackers are creative and they will subvert this. So we went years and years without SSRF being a major industry problem, and then Capital One happened, and then that was the only problem. And that's not a discredit to them. Amazing job on that response, and the transparency with the industry that let us become aware of how prevalent those attacks were about to become in the industry, right? It's fascinating, and it's years and years ago now, and now it's just a no-brainer that you can't just think about a web application firewall or a firewall on the edge being the control, because you have to assume that control can be subverted too.
Yeah. Derek, one other thing I definitely wanted to cover before we wrap up. We talked about, it's less technical, but it's the security champions, right? We talked about this offline. This is a concept that we've also talked about with some of our other guests. It's something that comes from my background as well, and it's something that I preach, honestly, to most of the companies we engage in, because no one has 10,000 security resources to throw at the problems of security in an organization. I'd love to hear, just from your experience, the value in a security champions program. What is it? What worked? What doesn't work?
Yeah, I'm very passionate about organizations striving and having security champions programs. I think, one, I don't think the engineer on the receiving end of a finding in our industry has often been treated with the respect they deserve. And I say that having been on the receiving end, right? Having spent so many years in my career. I didn't even get into the whole where I come from thing. We just dove in. But 15 years of my career was engineering focus. While I was often the security guy in the room, a lot of it was as on the other side of a security team. And it was often just a blind finding dropped in the night without a lot of good ability to get context. And they were a very busy and understaffed team for much of my career because of the time frame of what that we're talking about. The security teams over time got more and more resourced, but early on that it was often somebody who was just desperately trying to get people to secure something that at a larger company. And so I walked away from that with empathy. That's one of the things that I think about a lot. And security champions allow you to build an empathetic muscle inside of security by giving voice to the people who are actually doing the work. And they provide, I treat them like a security satellite. I think that if you're doing it right, you're providing them tools and capabilities to offload work from the core of the security team and provide escalation points for when you really need to be involved in the room. And they act as a general force multiplier without needing to expand your workforce explicitly. I think that if you're smart about running them as a security leader, you're treating it in a way that those security champions are rewarded by their leadership for being part of the program. That's one is critical. It can't be an albatross. If it's an albatross, then you're already losing an ally before you've gained them, because if they resent the program, then it's going to be a problem for you. So that's a big piece of that, and pushing the training and awareness to them, but also giving them line of sight to things that are coming and a voice in preventing stupid decisions. Security champions are your best ally in stopping yourself from making decisions as a leader that will burn you politically. Because it's easy to do that security, especially the more senior you get. You can offhandedly say something to an engineering manager that has a really bad repercussion. Maybe you say, hey, I want to disable this feature in these contexts. And they walk away with, I want to disable this feature. And now you later on, I've had this happen to me where a miscommunication and was stopped by a security champion because they knew me and we had a relationship and guidance from this previously. And they're like, I don't think that's what Derek meant. And so they asked me, and in fact, it was not what it meant. And the security champions help me. And the same thing, like with standards review, like letting security champions know a standard is coming. And if anybody is interested and has a vested interest in a subject, that they can review and provide feedback. I have a broader audience than I think many security leaders like to have and their standards reviews. But on the other hand, as a result, oftentimes on the other side of that, I tend to have more engagement. I think that building a muscle in the organization that is both driving an understanding of where you're going and where you are and security, but also providing a voice back, not treating your security champions as a megaphone, but like an actual open communication line is one of the keys to success of the program, regardless of how you're structuring it or what your priorities are. Maybe your priority is to get a level of base maturity in your organization, or maybe your priority is to accelerate security reviews, or whatever your reasoning that first causes you to drive security champions program. Because everybody's got to have something, I believe, or at least I think they should. You should have a look. If you just launch a security champions program without an outcome in mind, you might stumble trying to provide momentum and engagement. Whereas if you enter, I like threat models, you will own the threat model for your application. Enjoy, we'll review, we'll share, but you will own the threat model for your application. By doing that, you get them to think about the threat and the design. You have them thinking about security before it ever hits the security team. And you provide a call to action with an intrinsic artifact of value that anybody following a control framework, NIST SSTF, almost every control framework nowadays asks for threat modeling. Thankfully, it's no longer me ranting in a corner of an industry with a bunch of other people, but it's an accepted trend, which is nice, right? I think, and not to say that I'm invented by any means or was there's a lot of people who built that movement I latched onto, but it's nice having seen in the past few years it really become mainstream and adopted by NIST and other significant frameworks.
Just to recap what I heard from you, just to summarize it, and it goes back to the older mentality approach, right? Older security programs. I remember when I first joined, actually took on my first job in security. I remember the security group would do vulnerability scans, for example, and then just send that spreadsheet via email to the engineering team and say, have it patched by 30 days. That's what our policy says, right? And to your point, as you described the champion program, you're changing the engagement model, right? You're not using tech, you're changing how you engage people. Right. You get more buy-in when you ask for feedback, when you let them ask questions, and you can be supportive, right? So that's always a multiplier. Anytime I interact with a company today and I see they have bad hygiene, I never say go hire 10 more security resources so they can all tell everyone what to do. It's more, how do you bake security into the culture, right? And that all comes with how you engage them, right? And how you build those relationships and create that feedback loop, to your point.
100% technology can help security. It's a requirement. We need many of these controls, but at its core, at the beginning, security is a people problem. It's in how you write the software. It's in how you configure the software. It's how you configure your infrastructure. It's in how you respond to strange questions on the phone. It's in what emails you respond and click to. It's a people problem at its core that's driven by good behaviors. And one of the things I think a lot of psychology has shown us over the years is that beating people with sticks does not encourage good behaviors. It doesn't drive change, and it doesn't get buy-in and engagement. What does is provide people a voice.
Absolutely. Giving ownership too, right? That's a big part of security championing, is giving ownership. We all want more ownership, whether we like it or not sometimes, right? We like to have that feeling that we own it. And even with the hard work that comes along with that sometimes, or the uncomfortable, you feel a sense of pride and mission when you're more involved. And so that can shift an organization. I've literally talked to security leaders that the majority of the roles they've been in are smaller companies, of course. They've maybe built no security team, but they've just built security champions, and it was enough to get what needed to be done in their organization and stay compliant, and they didn't have any issues. Now, this is a great conversation, Derek. Like, you really brought some super insights into kind of how to think about the evolutions that are happening and the cross and convergences of different tool sets that I think we just have to constantly maybe step back for a moment and look at the landscape versus going back to the old mindsets that are very linear, and things now are just crossing over so much, and there's redefining of how to look at things on almost like monthly basis, I feel like, maybe daily sometimes, right? So it's just be flexible, be able to shift the way you think, and be open to new ideas and perspectives. And I think you've adopted those so well, but you've also tested what works and what doesn't, and then validate what works for your organization based on the context that you bring to the problem that you're solving. So it was great. Thanks so much for joining us on our show today. We really enjoyed it, and we'll have to have you on for maybe a second episode, like part 2. I think it would be really fun. A year later, look at where we are after we talked about this in 2025.
That sounds great. Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Jesse and Ramin. It was a really interesting conversation. I had a lot of fun with it. And yeah, I think you nailed the summarization of it. For me, it's just about evolving your thinking the same way the industry is evolving. If you stay stagnant for even like 3 months right now, you are likely to miss major boats.
Yeah, you can tell you stay on top of the updates, the news, the research. And I think that's healthy for every security leader. You have to, otherwise you get left behind. So yeah, great way to set the first of the year out and also set some great examples as a leader, how you do things. So I really hope this helps our audience and just continue to, as a community, secure the future together. So have a great rest of your day. Thanks all for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamei. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating.